Frank, please go ahead with your question.
Thanks, Donna. Hey, Tom. I had a question regarding copying of IOOCs. So you've often said that the LCS can simply copy IOOCs when in a virtual reality like ours, there is a population growth and new seats need to be filled with players. However, you've also said that when in a VR like ours, the population goes down, then those IOOCs that played avatars here can log on to other realities. And you've also said that copying IOOCs is not really always the best way for evolution, because evolution seeks diversity, not more of the same. I think you gave once an example of there's little point in having an entire planet populated only by goldfish, for example. So I wonder now whether this whole process of cloning IOOCs, have you verified that it does happen, or were you more considering that as a possibility when when we have population growth here and there are more humans on our planet?
Almost everything I say, Frank, I say it as a logical possibility. Some things, when I'm in the far reaches of theory like that, what does the LCS do? When I'm answering those kinds of questions, it's basically logically possible. And it seems the most likely, because the alternatives have other issues, other problems. Now, when I said it does a copy and paste, and let's say it has to add, 1,000 new seats today because the population went up by, or maybe 10,000 went up today. If that's the case, it obviously is not going to pick one and paste it 10,000 times, because that's counterproductive. That's not using the power of diversity. What it's going to do, it's going to go out and look at the population, and it's probably going to it may take random draws out of that population. Or it may just pick from the average, or it may say, okay, I'm going to take the average and I'm going to go plus or minus, 5 sigma on either side. Now, for those of you who aren't techies, 5 sigma means quite a bit of change, but not excessive change. So we're going to go plus or minus 5 standard deviations is what that is. And they may do that. They may just take samples out of that. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to say. I don't really go into the details of how the system might want to execute that. But when the system first created these, and when it created a lot of seats, let's say, to inhabit this planet, it had a lot of seats to create. I would think that it would have some way of some process, even some algorithm of assuring diversity, and maybe some of those things are the reasons, it may have this, okay, here are 12 different characteristics that people have, we'll make it up 12 or maybe, 16 or something. And then we will randomly pick, 3 of those 12 and combine them and make that somebody, some kind of process like that would produce diversity, because diversity is good. So I don't think it just makes one up and then makes 100 copies of that one and puts them out there. That wouldn't make much sense. Matter of fact, that may be why the people doing astrology who connect birth times and birthplaces as important to what happens, to what the character is like. If you're a Leo or a Sagittarius or something, you have certain characteristics. Perhaps that is part of the way the system did their random draws, just depended on where the person was and what the time was. We do that in random number generations often. To give the seed for the random number generator, we'll go to the clock in the computer and grab something and then take the the three numbers that were digit 6, 7, and 8 in that time. The time comes out as maybe a 12-digit number, and we'll take digit 6, 7, and 8 as the 3 digits, and that then will be the seed for our random number generator. That way we kind of randomize our seeds by using the clock time to grab a different number every time. Otherwise, you have a random number generating random numbers for seeds for random numbers, and it's nice to just reach into something like a clock to get that. The system may have said, all right, by time and place, those will be two inputs that'll be different for everybody. Nobody's born in exactly the same spot at exactly the same time. Well, not many, perhaps, in those days. And it may be a good way for you to put that data into my algorithm and come up with different types. I don't know. No, I'm just making this up right out of whole cloth. This is not a theory of Tom Campbell's. I'm just saying that there could be patterns like that. Or you have Myers-Briggs. They break into 16 different groups of personality types. And it could be that the system had 16 groups of things, and they randomly mixed and matched all of those to come up with IUOCs, proclivities or things. In the beginning, when there was no way to just go in and get averages, because there wasn't really any averages yet. It must have had some mechanism to do that. So I just think of ways that it could be done logically, and then I try to think of what's the most effective or efficient way to do that. And that's all.
So it's interesting that you're bringing this up, because you said that a few months ago in another Fireside Chat, and actually when you said that, and there already you didn't claim that you had verified this, you were just thinking out loud. But then I thought, but that would then only apply to those who were kind of newly created, and not to anyone who has lots of previous lifetimes. Which would mean that anyone who would claim that their character traits fit exactly their zodiac sign would be a brand new created IUOC, So I thought many people maybe would not like that idea necessarily.
Well, Frank, the idea is that the system would like to spread characteristics out among the possibilities, right? I mean, if it has to create new seats, again, it wants maximum diversity. So if it has some kind of a set of what the possibilities are, and if it has some way of then doing a random selection of those, and that a random selection, I don't know how that might be, then you may end up having things then that we could look at, from down here in the virtual reality. We may look at things and say, oh, I see patterns. I can break people into 16 different groups, or I can break people into 12 different groups. I see these patterns. And then you could make up a good story of, why those patterns are like that. And then you could name it and become famous. But it may have a connection into the algorithm or into the ways that the system decides how to ensure diversity in new IUOCs. Now, you have a little bit of a problem. You don't want all the IUOCs to start at zero, totally, high entropy, zero quality, and build yourself up, because every time you put new people in, you're dragging down the hole. You're making it very difficult for everybody else. So you'd want to put them in somewhere near the middle, right, as far as quality goes, because then they just are kind of like everybody else. And that would make their choices just like everybody else, and that would work much better. For the same reason, you don't want to put everybody in with, super high quality, because that's not helpful either to the whole. You need to put everybody in kind of in the middle, and then let them diverge based on the quality of their choices. But you don't want to start them too far away from what is typical. Otherwise, you're biasing their experiences. You're setting them up for certain kinds of experiences at that point, and now you're kind of putting biases into the game. and you don't want to do that. So these are the things I think about when I get asked the question, well, how do we get new IUCs? And then I just look at what seems like it's most reasonable, and I say that, but I'm not saying, listen, here's how it's done, and this is a fact. I don't do that when I'm talking about the LCS. I don't claim that kind of insight into how, the LCS, what the LCS does all day in its office. I don't know that.
If I can just add one last thought, because then I was thinking, okay, if some, IUOCs are indeed cloned, would their entire history of past experience packets be cloned as well? Could you, or wouldn't it? So could you recognize a new IUOC because, you try to look for past experiences and there are none? Or would you find that, several entities suddenly have the exact same past experience history, and now we have 1,000 times more people than several 10,000 times back, and then back in our history we all have the same life experiences, but maybe that's all pretty speculative.
Yeah, it's speculative, but I think the answer there is that the new ones really wouldn't have past life experiences. But most people have no access to past life experiences anyway. So the fact that you've had thousands or you had none, for 99.9% of the population, there's no difference. They don't really have that, and there's no way to accurately assess them and say, well, here's his experiences and here's his, and we can compare the two and see if they're the same. There's no way to do any of that. So my guess is that the system starts them with no experience. So they just start with the potential that's kind of average, somewhere in the average, maybe plus or minus, 4 dB or something. They just start in there somewhere. And then what they experience becomes their experience. So they probably, being a beginner, probably would never get to the point that they could start looking at past experiences. And if they did, they may find that they only went back so far and then there was a blank. That's a possibility. But it's a good bet that they'd probably have to be around through enough cycles that by the time they got to the point they were looking at their past lives, they'd probably they'd have plenty to keep them busy to look at.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
All right, Tom. All of the people present have presented their questions. I have a question from a couple who weren't able to show up, and this is from Giuseppe. He says, hello to everyone. I want to ask Tom from MBT view how one should deal with romantic love. Tom had been told that he will find his true love from his NPMR, that's non-physical matter reality friends. Can we all find out that way who will be the one? How romantic love works? What is its function in this virtual reality? Second part.
Okay. Well, I think both parts I can answer kind of together is that no, everyone isn't going to find out, that they have a true love that's only 2 years old and they're going to meet them when they're 35. That's not likely to happen. It just happened to me. Unusual things like that will happen to individuals, not just me. All through, there will be people who will be able to tell stories like that. So those stories are not rare, but it's not going to be an experience just that everybody's going to go have. Okay, the system does those things for its own reasons. So they just sometimes happen. So what is this thing about romantic love? Well, the pressures that push us toward making important choices almost all center around relationship. That's where the rubber meets the road in making choices that will help evolve you or de-evolve you. It's almost always about relationship. Not always. There's some of us, have other big choices that have big moral values to them and so on, and they're important as well. But on the everyday things that happen to you, where your choices matter the most, is going to be in relationship to people. Now, relationship to your boss, to your significant other, to your children, just to everybody you have a relationship with. It's how you deal with those relationships. And the deeper the relationship gets, the more significant choices you have. So having a significant other is important, to have that significant other, because that opens up possible happenings, possible scenarios, possible choices that you don't have. If all of your relationships are more superficial than that, then your choices will be more superficial than that. It's in those deep relationships. Now, it could be with a parent or with a sibling or your next door neighbor. I'm just talking about people. When I say significant other, I don't necessarily mean opposite sex spouse. I just mean people who are very significant in your life, who you have a deep connection with in your life. That's a significant other. The more significance, generally, the deeper the relationship. The less significance, the lighter and more superficial the relationship. So we have these romantic relationships that are pushed by our instincts, as we talked about in the beginning. We have instincts to pair up. We have instincts to have sex. We have instincts to, to do the things we do as far as gender relationships. And those instincts push us in those directions. Those instincts also put us into these significant other relationships. And that may be a spouse relationship or a dear friend or whatever. And, it doesn't matter whether they're same sex, opposite sex, or whatever. Maybe your best friend is your dog, and maybe that's your significant other, that could be too. But these relationships give us the opportunities to deal with questions of ego and belief and self-centeredness and that sort of thing, whereas relationships that are more superficial never challenge us at very deep levels. The deeper the relationship, the deeper the challenge for you. So that's why they're so important. They're tremendously important. You'll learn more from your significant others that are in your life than you will from, everybody else. And if you have a life and you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 significant others in it, that's a lot. You don't have a life with, 300 significant others in it. You have a life with 300 acquaintances, but only a handful of significant others. And you may have a handful. You may have 4 or 5 or 6 people that you're really, really close to and have deep relationships with. But these are the relationships that challenge you. Now, if it's all a bunch of just good friends and you all have been good friends for 50 years, those may be deep relationships, but they don't challenge you much unless all of your friends live together. Because then when you live together, you create all kinds of conflicts. Well, I want to do this, but I want to do that. But I want to live in a big house, but I want to live in a small house. But, you suddenly, when you live together, it throws in a whole lot of potential conflicts that you have to deal with your ego and with somebody else's ego. And that's why those are so important. So it's the people who not only have deep connections, but they have deep connections within a small space to maneuver in, to where you have to deal with each other and with each other's needs and with each other's issues and with each other's buttons and with each other's proclivities and attitudes and everything else. That's the rich ground for growing up. So that's why it matters. So our instincts lead us there to pair up. And then the deeper that gets, the more challenged our egos and our fears are. Most of our fears have to do with our own selves. You know, we're not good enough, or strong enough, or smart enough, or good looking enough, or confident enough, or whatever. Smart enough. You know, we have fears that mostly have to do with us. And if we just sit in a vacuum, well, you know, those fears don't amount to anything. We never have to deal with them. But when we get into a deep relationship in which we're living with somebody, then all of those things get triggered and massaged and punched, and then we get to make the choices that are important as far as our growth goes. So that's why, and that's what makes them important.
Okay, Tom, we have one more question from someone who couldn't make it today. They've submitted a question. No, this is from Gary from the UK. He says, Tom, in your MBT model, the subconscious is the repository of all our fears. And you have said once that we get rid of all of our fears, or when we do, there will be no subconscious. Bruce Lipton's interpretation of the subconscious is that it holds all the programs that automatically affect our thoughts and behavior from all the things taught to us by our parents in our childhood years through to the cultural programs we've accepted throughout the rest of our lives. He points out that some attributes of the subconscious are very negative, such as the fears that you also speak about, but it also holds the programs that we are entirely useful to us, such as basic things like learning to walk, or in later life, learning to drive, so that we can do these things on autopilot without having to relearn these skills from scratch every time. I guess this is a question about the computer architecture of the LCS, because I assume that when you say, when we get rid of our fears, there is no subconscious. You're not implying that we will also lose all of the useful programs stored there. I know that you say ultimately it is all functions of consciousness, and the way we compartmentalize the LCS is for the convenience of being able to talk about it. But just for clarity, could you explain where you see the non-fearful programs from early life existing? And secondly, in your model, where do the programs for operating the avatar reside?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of nomenclature and semantics is what we mean by the words we say. The subconscious that I kind of banish with getting rid of the fear is the subconscious that people talk about when they say, you know, their fears well up. They have behavior that they do and they're not sure why they do it. They have feelings that just come from nowhere, and then they feel them. And it's not, again, you don't think about being angry. Oh, I should be angry now. You know, anger just happens. And the subconscious was meant to answer all of those things that happen in consciousness that were not intentional. That's kind of, I think, where Freud was coming from when he defined a subconscious. You have your conscious mind, and that's your intentional mind. That's what you do on purpose because you want to do it. Those are the things you know. Okay, that's the memory you can recall. So that's what you're in control of, is the conscious mind. Then, because there was a whole lot of things that people aren't in control of, and a whole lot of things that come from places that are not intentional, including memories that just bubble up from nowhere and other things like that, Freud had to have another basket to collect all those things that are not controlled by our conscious awareness, by our intention. So he called it a subconscious, and then he just offloaded all the stuff that, you know, wasn't stuck somewhere else into that, all the non-intentional stuff. So it's the fears and the people have a sense of, it's not just fears, but have a sense that there's some part of them deep down that just is problematic and there's nothing they can do about it. Throw up your hands and, well, I just can't do that. That's just me. And a deep down level in my subconscious, I'm just fearful, or I have these issues. I have anger. I have this. I have that. I was abused, or I was abandoned, and now deep down at this level, and it affects all kinds of things I do. But it's not my fault. I'm not aware of it. It just comes out, and I'm helpless. And it was against that sort of thinking that I talked about. You get rid of your subconscious. You get rid of all of that stuff that's basically fearful things that are problems and negative. You don't have those anymore. Once you get rid of that fear, all that disappears, and you don't have that stuff that comes out and haunts you, and your feelings and your actions, your anger, and you think, well, boy, where does that come from? Why did I just suddenly get so angry when that person told me they thought, that I was totally wrong and didn't know what I was talking about, and I got angry? Why was that? Well, that's the part that I was referring to as far as you don't have that subconscious. Other people will say, well, my sexual attitudes are not my own. I don't choose to be sexual. I don't choose to want to do all this. It's just deep inside of me, and I just feel compelled to do these things. Feel compelled to go out and find a mate. I'm compelled to have children. I'm compelled to do all these things, and I don't know where that compulsion comes from. So we'll throw that into that subconscious with all the other things that we don't know where they come from, and that's part of the subconscious. Well, those mainly come from our instincts. That's what Freud called the id. And the id lives down there in the subconscious. You're not aware of the id. It just sits there and churns out attitudes and feelings, but you're not really the source of them. You're not in control of them. They happen. So that's why they get thrown into the subconscious, sub-aware, below your own volition, your own intent. All right. And that sort of thing goes away also when you get rid of your fears. You realize, of course, you're a sexual being. That's part of being a Homo sapien. And that you've got these instincts, and these instincts will nudge you and give you feelings and urges and that sort of thing. And you need to accept them and then deal with them in a positive way. So that all becomes not something that's hidden down in the dark areas of your soul someplace. It becomes just a part of who you are. So those things also I was talking about. But now, people like Bruce have evidently have decided, well, there's some other things that are unknown and unseen that we don't do by our own volition, and that's our programming. Okay, well, anything that we don't do on purpose, we throw it down in that subconscious. Well, instead of doing that, making that subconscious kind of the basket where we throw everything that comes out automatically, I don't necessarily do that. So now this is just a choice in semantics. Those things we just talked about is what I call the subconscious, and that's the stuff that disappears once you get rid of your fear. The stuff that's automatic is just learned behavior. It's learned motor skills, like learning to walk or learning to talk. We don't have to put that in the subconscious, because we no longer have to think about where we place our feet and how to move them. We just do them automatically. That's that programming. I don't stick that in the subconscious. I say that's just a part of us. It's a part of us that we have memorized, if you will. It's a part of us that we do without thinking. We just walk. We have an intention to go from A to B, and to walk that distance, we just do it. We don't think about what leg we're going to move next and what the weight should be on our heel or on the ball of our foot. We just do it. And we can learn that in anything. When you learn to be a runner, you don't do the same things as when you walk. You kind of leap, and you always land on your heel. And then from that heel, you roll up onto your toes, because that's the shock absorption that keeps you from, damaging all your joints. And that's not natural. And when people first start to run, they tend to run flat-footed. Bang, 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 flat-footed. They tend to hurt their knees and other things because it takes you to develop muscles in order to do that leap and that heel land and roll to the toes. So somebody reads a book or gets a coach and they tell you, well, you're not running in the right way. That's why your knees hurt. And then you practice it and then you get better at it and then you forget about it. And whenever you run, you just do it right because you've learned. Or you swim, you learn to swim. You learn the right kind of strokes and styles. And then once you jump in the water, you just do it right. Well, I don't put that in the subconscious. All the programming that we have, the things we just do, I say that we learn that, and that gets part of our, in our consciousness, we've got sets of tools that we use, things that we learn how to manipulate. And our body, and our muscular is one of those things. We learn how to catch a ball that's been hit up in the air and it's going to go, 150 feet. And we're going to run and hold up a glove such that that ball, and doing its trajectory with the wind and the influences that's there, is going to hit just in this little spot. That glove is going to hit right there. And we can make that happen. Not because we're so clever at projecting parabolas in space and calculating wind driftage and other things. It's because we've just learned how to do that, and we do it automatically without thinking. We build up those programs, and that's the way consciousness works. Is you build up a program, and the program is just like a program in calculator. Now you can learn how to do square roots or cube roots, and if you work at it, you can eventually train your mind to be just like a calculator. And somebody can say, what's the cube root of 6,842? You can tell them just like that. Not because you thought about it and went through a clever process and you're just fast at doing math, but you've trained your consciousness just like as a little calculator in there, and you just put in the number, hit the button, and up comes the answer, and you see the answer and you can speak it. These things can be done. They take practice. You can learn how to memorize things. It takes practice. But you can get the brain to not only do parabolic trajectories, you can, it's another calculation. First time you throw a child a ball, he's, like this, trying to catch it. And the first 100 times he does that, he begins building up an algorithm that starts calculating trajectories. And pretty soon he knows where that ball's going. Almost the instant it leaves your hand, because he's learned that. So these are programs. Remember? Consciousness, digital computers, programs, calculators. You can take a subset of that consciousness and make it into a calculator that does cube roots if you work at it. Not many of us want to spend the hours required to do cube roots. It's just not that thing we want to do, that we want to spend thousands of hours, to program our minds to do that. But some people do, and they can do that. It's a possibility. So that's the way I see it. I don't throw all that stuff that's automatic into the subconscious. I put that elsewhere. I say that's just a program in consciousness. We can program subsets of our consciousness to do all kinds of amazing things. Parabolic trajectories is just, one of them. Otherwise, nobody'd ever catch anything that was thrown at them if you couldn't, calculate a parabolic trajectory. And if you were in a different gravitational field, you'd have to practice to have a whole new calculation. The old calculator wouldn't work anymore. You'd never catch anything. And then eventually you'd develop another little calculator that calculated parabolic trajectories in that gravitational field. Like the people who put on the glasses that give you images that are upside down. This was a test done back in the 50s. So they put on a pair of lenses, reverse all your images upside down. So now people seem to be standing on the ceiling and going, everything's the other way. And at first, the people who put on these glasses that invert everything, they can't move around because a door now looks like the door's hanging from the ceiling, and it takes them, they have to kind of feel their way around through things to make the adjustment, and it's very, very clumsy. But after a few days of walking around with everything inverted, they can walk around in that space just fine. They're not clumsy at it. And if they wear them all the time, they can get just as functional walking around in a space where everything's inverted as they can otherwise. And then they take the glasses off, and oh my God, they can't, it takes them a while to adjust again to things being right side up. That's just training that computer called consciousness into how it processes the data. Okay, so all those automatic things are just subroutines, I guess we should say. They're just subroutines that are in the consciousness computer there. That this little information system we call consciousness. So it's in our own. There's subroutines that are inside our own IUOC, and we can generate them. We can get rid of them. And I don't necessarily feel like I throw that stuff in the subconscious just because we don't intellectually access them. They get accessed as needed. It's like a call function goes up. Oh, somebody threw a ball. Now I need to catch it. So the call goes out to the trajectory calculator, and I start to run in the direction that my feet take. And my hand reaches in the direction that it seems like the best thing to do. And I just let all that flow. And if I don't let it flow and I try to do it from my intellect, I can never catch anything. I'd be clumsy. So it all becomes intuitive, not intellectual. So it's just different in the way Bruce and I label things, basically, is the only difference there.
Okay, well, I hope that answered your question, Gary. Gary's on listening mode. Internet connection is not the best. So I'm going to go ahead with one of the MBT forum questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. If we don't get to all the MBT forum questions, we will do another addendum that we got some good feedback on last time. They appreciated that all the questions were asked. And I also have some questions that were emailed to Keith that I'm going to get a copy to Oliver of, so we can make them official questions in the database there. So one question, Tom, we've got a few minutes left, is from MBT forum user Hendrik. You've mentioned having several MPMR beings whom you have interacted with for a long time, since you were very young. Did they help you develop aspects of MBT? Did they already understand certain aspects? And what elements of MBT were new to their understanding?
Well, I got very little direct help from anybody developing MBT. It was required that I develop it myself out of my own experience. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to answer questions. If it was dictated to me, or somebody said, oh, it's like this or it's like that, and it wasn't my own, it'd just be a belief of mine that I believe that this is the way it is. But it had to be an experience of mine. It had to get from my own experimentation, from my own experience. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been real, and I wouldn't be very good at answering questions. So it had to be mine to be authentic. So I had to authentically create it out of my own experience. So I didn't get much direct help. But I got plenty of nudges as far as I needed to write a book. I needed to understand it well enough that it made sense. Instead of just saying, well, I sort of got it and that's good enough, which is what we do a lot of the time. I had the inclination, things will get clearer if you're forced to write them down. So write them down. And I did. And then I'd look at the writing and I'd say, well, I could see why people are confused. That's not very coherent. Let me see if I can fix that, and kept working at it. So I had the nudges to put it down, to write it, to do it, and to keep working at it, to put in the years. The book writing process was about a 5-year process, and that's probably putting, I don't know, probably 30 to 40 hours a week into it, almost as much time writing a book as I put into my job, almost as much. So I could put in 5 or 6 hours a day and still do my job, and then I could do it on weekends to make up for those other hours I didn't get to do it. So almost a full-time job, not quite, for 5 years. So there's a lot of effort that went into it. And obviously I didn't have everything figured out when I started. I just had the basic pieces of it. I had all the consciousness facts and the material facts that I had gathered through my experience, but finding out some way to string those together, I didn't know how to do that. But it came, and I'd get nudges to keep going and nudges to work it out. And it eventually pulled together, but it was all indirect in the nudges. Never, here's how it works. And if I tried to ask, well, I'm stuck on this point, I got this conflict, I got this, and the two are incompatible with each other. Which one's right and which one's wrong? I never could get an answer for that. There just was no answer. It's like, figure it out. So that was my experience. And I think that's probably true for most people. No, I don't know. I guess there are people who are mediums and they take dictation from some spirit guide or something, and they're just supposedly passing it on. But they actually have to have those concepts in their mind or they wouldn't be able to interpret them. So there's limitations there as well, but I didn't get that kind of help. And I don't recall that anytime any of my non-physical friends said, oh, I didn't understand that. Now I've run into non-physical beings who obviously knew less about the nature of reality than I did, because everybody you run into in the non-physical doesn't necessarily mean that they're have any particular knowledge or wisdom. Just by not being physical doesn't make you wise or knowledgeable. But most of my friends knew a whole lot more than I did, but they weren't saying anything because it had to be mine. And even if they did say something, they may or may not have been able to understand it fully. So that's why you have to do it yourself.
Yeah, that was highlighted very well in the last interview that we did, the science of the Akashic Records, when you went through the whole process of how you determined the databases, which was for thousands of years known as Akashic Records, their use, how you tested each one to see that the past was void of free will, and how you tested the others very, very scientifically, repeatedly, over a long period of time. So that was very much a lot of research, and what you're saying right now, you all had to do that.
Yeah, well, that's why it took me 35 years before I started writing the book. It's tedious doing science and checking things out and doing it again and changing a variable and doing it again. And then, when you heal somebody and they happen to get better, well, maybe they just got better anyway. You have to do it many, many, many times. So in order to come up with facts of consciousness, it took a lot of time and a lot of work to get there. It wasn't just, these are the things I believe. That wouldn't have been helpful. It had to be, these are the things that I figured out through logical derivation and through experimenting with the logic to see whether it made sense or not. So it took a long time to figure these things out.
How you tested the past was interesting because you mentioned you can see it as a movie, you can join it as a movie, or you can simply get the information. Very telling of a virtual reality and easy to understand because in the dream reality, that's what you're doing. And most people are familiar, or practically everyone, familiar with the dream reality. So that analogy should be very easy to understand how you were able to test out those databases.
Sometimes I was looking for help, but none came. It was not going to be made easy. And later, by the time I was done with it all, I realized there was a good reason why I didn't get any direct help. You don't learn as much if somebody tells you the answer than if you figure it out.
I think it's why you always say if it's not your experience, it's not your truth. And it's one of the things that's really significant about MBT is that it is focused on the individual and their own experience. Well, thank you very much, Tom, for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we will see you next month.